Welcome to the Tracker Group audio briefing. This summary is authored by Planet Tracker and presented with AI narration. It distills key insights for investors, policymakers, and financial decision makers, wherever you are. Today I'm summarizing Planet Tracker's report, The Silence of the Loans. Banks should adopt methane policies that cover financing and facilitating emissions. The report examines how banks are financing and facilitating methane-intensive activities in the food system, particularly through exposure to large meat, dairy, and rice companies, while largely failing to address agricultural methane as a distinct financial risk in their climate frameworks. The report focuses on 25 banks that provide lending and underwriting to 15 of the largest meat, dairy, and rice companies. Together, those banks provide $159 billion of financing and facilitation to these companies, which Planet Tracker estimates are associated with around 1.3 million tons of methane emissions per year. The central message is that agricultural methane remains materially under-addressed in bank climate policy, despite being financially relevant. Methane is responsible for roughly 0.5 degrees Celsius of current global warming. Agriculture accounts for around 40% of methane emissions, and the sector is exposed to rising transition, regulatory, physical, and reputational risk. For banks, this is not simply a disclosure issue. It is a question of credit quality, capital allocation, portfolio resilience, and the credibility of transition planning. A key contribution of the report is its distinction between financed emissions and facilitated emissions. Banks do not only lend directly through loans, they also facilitate bond issuance and other capital markets activity. That distinction matters because most bank climate targets still focus on financed emissions only, even though 96% of the debt finance identified in this sample is in the form of bonds, in other words, facilitated finance. Only JP Morgan, Barclays, and Citi are identified as having targets that cover both financed and facilitated emissions, yet none have formal agricultural methane-specific targets for agriculture. This creates a significant blind spot. Banks can maintain headline climate commitments while continuing to support methane-intensive companies through capital markets activity that sits outside the scope of most current targets. For a financial audience, the implication is clear. Current disclosures may understate real exposure to methane-related transition risk. The report also quantifies how concentrated this exposure is. The 15 companies analysed represent 57% of the emissions of the 52 food companies covered in Planet Tracker's earlier methane work. Within that smaller group, methane exposure is heavily concentrated in a few multinational companies, particularly JBS and Tyson Foods. JBS alone is identified as the largest methane emitter in the sample, and Tyson becomes highly significant because of the breadth of bank exposure to it. In fact, 23 of the 25 banks analysed have exposure to Tyson Foods. Planet Tracker uses this company data to estimate a funded methane footprint for banks. The purpose is not to claim ownership of corporate emissions in a legal sense, but to show where methane-related financial exposure sits in the banking system. That matters because banks face multiple channels of risk if methane remains unmanaged. The report groups those risks into 4 areas. First, short-term physical risk. Climate disruption is already affecting agricultural production through heat stress, drought, flooding, and water variability, which can weaken borrower revenues, margins, and liquidity. Second, medium-term transition risk. Issuers without credible methane reduction plans may face higher risk premia, weaker valuations, and reduced access to capital. Third, regulatory risk. Expanding expectations around financed emissions, methane disclosure, and net zero credibility create compliance and misstatement risks. Fourth, reputational risk. Food system controversies can trigger rapid market repricing when confidence in resilience is already under pressure. The report includes a useful comparative assessment of bank policies. Rabobank ranks first, with the most developed approach in the group. It explicitly recognizes methane, includes agriculture within its climate strategy, and sets agricultural methane-related targets. However, even Rabobank's approach remains incomplete because it does not yet include facilitated emissions. JP Morgan, Barclays, and Citi stand out because they include both financed and facilitated emissions in their accounting frameworks. But none has formal agriculture methane targets, which means broader scope does not yet translate into methane-specific ambition. Barclays is clearly aware of agricultural methane risks, but has no specific targets or policies on agriculture methane. Its targets vary considerably by sector. Whilst Barclays' approach to financing emissions includes facilitating, bond issuance is largely not applicable given the bank's focus on farmers and small operating companies. Deutsche Bank stands out in a different way. It is the only bank in the sample with explicit language on withdrawing funding from clients unwilling or unable to transition, but it still has no methane-specific policy for food or agriculture. Beyond those examples, the broad pattern is limited integration. Many banks mention methane only in the context of oil and gas, not agriculture. Others mention agriculture but do not set clear targets. And many rely mainly on intensity-based targets, which the report argues can be misleading because absolute emissions may still rise if production grows faster than intensity falls. The report also reviews the sustainability standards banks use to frame disclosure. Its conclusion is that current standards still do not fully capture methane risk in agriculture. The GHG protocol remains foundational, but it does not require borrower Scope 3 disclosure and does not include facilitated emissions. Planet Tracker estimates that, in this context, it captures less than 1% of greenhouse gas emissions from banks' food processing clients. Among the standards reviewed, Planet Tracker identifies PCAF as the most advanced because it requires banks to report borrower Scope 3 emissions and to include facilitated emissions using estimation methods where data is incomplete. That matters because in food systems, much of the methane sites upstream at farm level and is counted as Scope 3 for processors. Without that layer, banks do not have a complete view of financed risk. For financial actors, 3 calls to action stand out from the report. First, banks should explicitly recognize agricultural methane as a material financial risk, especially in meat, dairy, and rice. The report argues that methane should be treated as a systemic climate and portfolio issue, not only as a peripheral ESG topic. Second, banks should set quantitative methane targets that cover both financed and facilitated emissions, and they should use absolute reductions rather than relying only on intensity metrics. They should also require clients to disclose Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, publish methane-specific transition plans, and demonstrate implementation of methane abatement measures. Third, banks should link methane performance to capital allocation. That means integrating methane into credit assessment, using sustainability-linked finance structures carefully, restricting new finance where no credible transition plan exists, and establishing escalation pathways that can ultimately lead to withdrawal of support where clients are unwilling or unable to transition. This summary covers only the essentials. The full report is worth reading because it sets out the bank-by-bank scorecard in detail, explains the methane footprint methodology, and reviews the standards and disclosure gaps that shape how agricultural methane is currently measured. It is based on extensive datasets and frameworks, including geologic debt data, company debt, and emissions analysis from Planet Tracker's earlier methane research and review of standards such as the GHG Protocol, ISSB, and PCAF. To access the full report, visit Planet Tracker's research page. Full access to the underlying data may be possible upon request by contacting info@planet-tracker.org. Thank you for listening.